Towering stone fortresses once dominated the Sardinian landscape, silent sentinels of a mysterious civilization that flourished when Egypt built pyramids. The Nuragic people constructed thousands of these distinctive circular towers, engineering marvels built without mortar, yet standing millennia later. From humble beginnings as obsidian traders, they evolved into complex bronze-working societies with elaborate water temples and sacred wells. Warriors in horned helmets defended territories, while priests performed rituals at megalithic giants' graves. Though eventually absorbed by Carthage and Rome, their legacy endures in stone monuments that still crown Sardinia's hills, testaments to an island people who created something truly extraordinary. Wind howled across the high plateaus of Sardinia, bending wild grasses that clung to limestone ridges. From above, the island seemed to rise from the sea like a fortress of stone, a place both remote and alluring. In hidden coves, waves struck black glassy rocks that glittered in sunlight. Obsidian from Monte Arci, the mountain whose veins of volcanic glass would one day travel in ships across the Mediterranean. Long before the first towers of the Nuragic world stood against the sky, men and women carved their existence into this landscape, leaving traces that still whisper of their presence. Across the island's valleys, small groups of settlers began taming the land. They sowed grain in clearings, raised goats on stony slopes, and sought shelter in caves that had echoed with the sounds of earlier hunter-gatherers. Slowly, a new way of life emerged. By the late Stone Age, Sardinia was no longer a forgotten outpost, but part of a wider world where obsidian blades and polished axes connected distant communities. These early islanders were not isolated primitives. They were traders, builders, and dreamers who looked beyond survival toward permanence. The Ozieri culture, flourishing between 4,000 and 3,200 years before Christ, marked Sardinia's first great flowering. In low villages, people shaped pottery, whose elegance still surprises. Bowls with swirling red decorations, vases etched with intricate patterns. Their art spoke of imagination that reached beyond necessity. Figures of mother goddesses, carved in clay and stone, suggest a people who revered fertility and the cycles of life, binding their communities to the rhythms of earth and sky. Each vessel and figurine offers a glimpse of minds intent on beauty as much as function. Death, too, became part of this enduring dialogue with stone. On hillsides and cliffsides, families cut chambers deep into the rock, the Domus de Janas, houses of the fairies. To later generations, these tombs seemed magical, doorways into another world, but to their builders, they were the resting places of ancestors. Carved doorframes, false windows, and symbols of horns decorated the interiors, transforming burial into an act of architecture. Inside, the dead were not forgotten. Bones mingled with offerings of food and pottery, as if life might continue in subterranean halls beyond daylight's reach. Travelers who approached Monte Arci in those centuries would have seen a mountain shimmering with treasure. Obsidian, harder than copper, sharper than steel when knapped, flowed from its slopes in abundance. Local craftsmen chipped it into blades, arrowheads, and scrapers, tools prized from Iberia to the Adriatic. Sardinian obsidian has been found as far as southern France and northern Italy, evidence of trade routes stretching hundreds of miles. Each fragment of volcanic glass was more than a tool. It was currency, reputation, and connection to a sea of peoples who valued what this island uniquely possessed. Yet obsidian was not Sardinia's only gift to history. Near Sassari, on a low plateau, builders raised something without parallel in Europe at the time, the altar of Monte da Codi. a massive stepped structure, part temple, part platform. It rose against the horizon like a solitary ziggurat. Stone ramps led upward to a flattened summit, where rituals unfolded under open sky. Animal bones, pottery fragments, and traces of fire reveal offerings that bound communities to gods or ancestors. Whether sacrifice, celebration, or cosmic alignment, the altar proclaimed ambition. These islanders had the will to shape earth and stone into sacred architecture on a monumental scale. Daily life intertwined with these grand creations. Fields yielded wheat and barley, harvested with sickles tipped with obsidian blades. Herds of sheep and goats supplied wool, meat, and milk. In hearth-lit huts, women spun fibers into cloth, while men shaped axes from polished stone. Children learned to chip flint and tend fires, absorbing traditions that had already endured for centuries. This was not an age of warriors or kings, but of communities whose achievements rested on patience, skill, and continuity. Their villages, though modest, pulsed with the steady rhythm of survival sustained by craft and cooperation. Rituals bound these communities together as much as survival needs did. At Monte da Codi, feasts likely drew families from surrounding villages, their gatherings filled with song, fire, and offerings. Domus de Janus, scattered across the landscape, reminded the living of their bond with the dead. In every carved doorway, one feels the insistence that life and death were part of a cycle, not a divide. The people who built these tombs did not hide from mortality. They embraced it as a continuation of the human story, binding generations in stone. The Chalcolithic, or Copper Age, brought new possibilities. From mines at Fontana Raminosa and elsewhere, islanders began extracting copper, hammering and casting it into ornaments and tools. Stone still dominated daily life, but copper introduced novelty and prestige. A copper blade was more than a weapon. It was a sign of connection to distant networks, proof that Sardinia was no longer a provincial backwater, but a participant in the dawn of metallurgy. Traders carried these new materials across the sea, linking the island to the growing Bronze Age world that stirred on the horizon. Contact with outsiders shaped Sardinia in subtle but lasting ways. The beaker culture, spreading across Europe, left its mark here through pottery styles and burial customs. Bell-shaped drinking vessels appear in graves, testifying to an exchange not only of goods, but of ideas and symbols. Sardinian communities did not simply copy foreign fashions. They blended them with local traditions, weaving external influences into the tapestry of their own identity. Even before the rise of the Nuragic towers, the island's people showed a capacity for adaptation that would define their future. Still, behind trade and ritual lay the land itself, stern yet generous. Mountains provided refuge, forests supplied timber, and rivers watered fields that yielded grain enough for clustered villages. But Sardinia was never an easy place to tame. Rocky soils and sudden droughts forced resilience. Communities learned to work with the land's rhythms rather than against them, building a culture both practical and enduring. Each altar stone, each obsidian blade, each carved tomb embodied this balance between hardship and achievement. By the close of the 3rd millennium before Christ, Sardinia stood poised for transformation. Its people had mastered stone, harnessed copper, carved sanctuaries, and forged networks that reached across the sea. They honored their ancestors in tombs hewn from rock, and their gods on platforms that rose toward the heavens. They had turned isolation into opportunity, shaping an island into a place of significance in the prehistoric Mediterranean. What came next would surpass even these accomplishments. As towers of stone began rising from valleys and ridges, Nuraghi that would dominate the landscape for centuries. The age of villages, tombs, and altars was drawing to a close. Ahead lay the world of monumental towers, bronze warriors, and far-reaching trade. But the foundations of that world lay firmly in these early centuries. Without the artistry of the Osieri, the sacred landscapes of the Domus de Janus, the trade in Monte Arci obsidian, and the cosmic ambition of Monte d'Acodi, the Nuragic civilization would never have risen. The stones already spoke. Soon they would sing in towers that touched the sky. A hammer struck copper against stone, and sparks leapt in the gloom of a cavern deep within Sardinia's rugged hills. The metallic ring echoed down tunnels where miners had carved into veins of bright ore, their lamps flickering in the stale air. Outside, sunlight-bathed slopes where herders guided flocks across rocky pastures, unaware that these early blows of copper against anvil would change the island forever. The Bronze Age was dawning, and Sardinia stood ready to join a new chapter of human history. Around 1800 years before Christ, the old world of stone tools began to yield to one shaped by metal. Obsidian still glimmered in workshops and tombs, but its supremacy was ending. Copper, drawn from the earth, hammered into form, and alloyed with tin, gave rise to a material stronger, sharper, and more enduring than any stone blade. In villages scattered across valleys and ridges, men experimented with casting, pouring molten copper into molds of clay. The hiss of cooling metal marked the birth of a technology that would transform not only tools and weapons, but the very structure of society. This transformation found its first expression in the Bonanaro culture, which flourished between 1800 and 1600 before Christ. Archaeologists see it as the bridge between Neolithic villagers and the Nuragic builders who would follow. Bonanaro communities left behind pottery, plain in decoration, but solid in form, a contrast to the ornate ceramics of their Osieri ancestors. Yet what they lacked in artistry, they made up for in sturdiness, echoing a society that prized durability and function over flourish. Their settlements, clusters of circular huts, already hinted at the architectural patterns that would define the Nuragic age. Life in these early Bronze Age villages revolved around kinship groups. Extended families occupied round houses with stone bases and roofs of timber and reed. Smoke curled from central hearths, where meals of barley bread and goat stew simmered. Men tilled small fields, drove cattle, or mined copper from deposits like Fontana Raminosa, while women spun wool, ground grain, and raised children within stone-ringed courtyards. These were not sprawling cities, but tightly bound communities, each family a piece of the larger mosaic of island life. Still, bronze did more than sharpen blades. It sharpened hierarchies. Metal was costly to mine and complex to produce. Those who controlled access to ore veins or trade routes gained prestige and power. Chiefs emerged, men who wore bronze daggers at their sides as visible proof of authority. Such leaders no longer ruled only by kinship or age. They ruled through control of resources. The sparkle of a metal blade in firelight announced status as surely as wealth or courage. Power, once scattered, began concentrating in the hands of those who mastered the mysteries of metal. The mines themselves reveal the daring of these communities. At Fontana Raminosa, shafts cut deep into hills, their walls scarred by picks of stone and copper. Workers descended into darkness with torches, carrying baskets of ore to the surface where smelting fires awaited. Air bellows pumped flames hot enough to transform rock into gleaming metal. The process was laborious, dangerous, and time-consuming, yet it linked Sardinia into the vast economic web of the Mediterranean. Bronze ingots, whether cast locally or carried abroad, placed this island firmly within the circuits of trade. Sardinia's geography offered more than copper. Its position, wedged between Italy, Iberia, and North Africa, made it a natural crossroads. Seafarers from distant coasts recognized its value. Traces of beaker culture, already noted in earlier centuries, lingered through the early Bronze Age, showing that Sardinia's people were part of larger conversations that stretched across Europe. Foreign vessels arrived bearing goods, ideas, and perhaps even families, leaving behind pottery, ornaments, and burial styles that blended into local traditions. The islanders absorbed these influences, but transformed them into something distinctly their own. Archaeological remains show that early fortifications began to rise during this era. On hilltops and ridges, communities built walls of piled stone, rough precursors to the Nuraghi that would later dominate the landscape. These fortifications suggest unease, raiding between clans, competition for resources, or simply the desire to display strength. Inside the walls, circular huts clustered in small groups, each settlement a microcosm of kinship, labor, and belief. Around hearths, elders recounted myths of ancestors, while outside, shepherds watched skies burn red with sunset over rugged horizons. The sea remained both barrier and bridge. Sardinia's coasts offered harbors for traders, who carried obsidian, metals, and crafted goods across waters that connected islands and continents. From Iberia to the Tyrrhenian, seafarers sought what Sardinia could provide. In return, they left fragments of their own cultures, pottery from distant lands, tools fashioned in foreign styles, and stories that mingled with local traditions. For the Bonanaro villagers, such contact confirmed that their world was part of a wider drama playing out across Bronze Age Europe. Weapons forged in copper and early bronze altered how disputes were settled. A polished dagger or axe blade carried both practical and symbolic weight. Clashes between clans could now end more swiftly and more decisively. Warriors who wielded metal gained reputations that carried across valleys. Yet alongside violence came alliance, marriages sealed between families, feasts shared beneath the stars, and oaths sworn over hearths ensured that conflict did not consume entirely the fragile balance of island life. The cycle of rivalry and reconciliation shaped communities as much as trade and technology. The Bonanaro culture also left behind collective tombs. Some reused older megalithic structures, while others carved new chambered graves. In these resting places, the dead lay with ornaments of bronze, beads, and simple vessels. Their burials reflect continuity with Neolithic traditions, but also change. The presence of metal goods signaled both wealth and status, proof that in death, as in life, inequality had begun to carve its mark on Sardinian society. Tombs became not only sacred spaces, but monuments proclaiming the power of lineages who could afford to bury their dead with bronze. Though modest by later standards, these early Bronze Age communities carried within them the seeds of the Nuragic explosion. Circular huts foreshadowed villages that would cluster around towers. Fortified enclosures hinted at the defensive genius that would one day produce stone bastions of unrivaled scale. The control of copper presaged the wealth and influence that Sardinia would wield in Mediterranean trade. And in the everyday lives of herders, farmers, miners, and potters, the island learned the rhythms of cooperation, conflict, and adaptation that would sustain civilization for centuries. By 1600 before Christ, Sardinia was no longer the land of obsidian villages alone. It had entered a new epoch, one where copper and bronze, power and prestige shaped destinies. The Bonanaro culture, though simple compared to what followed, bridged two worlds: the Neolithic age of tombs and altars, and the Nuragic age of towers and warriors. The hammer strikes that echoed in those mines were more than sounds of labor. They were the heartbeat of transformation. Soon, from hills and valleys, stone towers would rise, proclaiming to the sea that a new civilization had begun. Stone groaned as men hauled it across rough earth, ropes biting into their shoulders, wooden sledges creaking under the weight. With rhythmic chants, they dragged boulders toward a rising tower that seemed to defy the very sky. Each block, fitted without mortar, became part of a wall curving upward in deliberate circles. Inside, corbelled chambers took shape, their ceilings closing overhead as stones leaned inward until light from the open sky was reduced to a single eye above. From valleys and ridges, neighbors watched in awe as a new kind of monument rose. Sardinia was entering an age of towers, an age that would define it for more than 1,000 years. Around 1,600 years before Christ, Sardinia's villages began to transform into something unprecedented. Earlier ages had produced tombs, altars, and fortifications, but nothing matched the ambition of the Nuraghi. These massive towers, built of dry stone, spread across the island in astonishing numbers. Archaeologists estimate between 7,000 and 8,000 once stood, each the heart of a settlement. Their presence was so pervasive that they reshaped both the physical and cultural landscape. To approach a Sardinian valley in this age was to see stone towers rising like guardians, their silhouettes commanding horizon and field alike. The origins of the Nuraghi lie in the so-called Proto-Nuragic, or corridor towers. These early structures, appearing around 1800 before Christ, resembled low fortresses more than soaring towers. Built of thick walls, enclosing labyrinthine passages, they lacked the vertical ambition of later forms, but contained the seeds of what would follow. Within their walls, families and leaders controlled space, protected resources, and displayed authority. Step by step, builders experimented with technique until corbelling, the method of stacking stones inward to create a dome, allowed walls to climb higher, ceilings to close, and towers to emerge in their distinctive tholos form. The engineering was audacious. Without mortar, masons shaped massive stones into precise fits, balancing weight and gravity to create stability that has endured for over 3,000 years. Inside, corbelled chambers rose like inverted beehives, their symmetry remarkable given the tools available. Narrow staircases spiraled upward within the walls, leading to upper levels and terraces where sentinels might watch for threats or signal allies. Entrances were often low and narrow, forcing entrants to stoop, a reminder of who commanded the space within. These towers were not crude piles, but sophisticated achievements of design and labor. Types of Nuraghi varied across the island. The simplest, single-tower forms dotted hilltops and valleys alike, sometimes standing alone, sometimes accompanied by a handful of huts. More complex examples developed into multi-towered fortresses, with central keeps surrounded by bastions and walls that enclosed villages. Some sites grew into true citadels, multiple towers linked by ramparts, courtyards, and water systems. The architectural diversity reveals not only regional differences, but also the adaptability of Sardinian builders, who could tailor their monuments to terrain, community size, and political needs. To speak of numbers is to recognize scale. Thousands of Nuraghi covering Sardinia's surface, more densely distributed than castles in medieval Europe. Each one likely demanded the coordinated labor of dozens, if not hundreds, of workers, transporting stones, shaping them, and lifting them into place required communal effort. Such construction projects bound villages together, turning architectural ambition into social cohesion. The towers were not merely defensive, they were statements that a community possessed the strength to command resources, labor, and vision. To build a Nuraghi was to proclaim identity. Socially, the Nuraghi functioned as more than fortresses. They served as centers of authority, where chiefs asserted dominance over surrounding lands. Within their chambers, decisions were made, alliances forged, and rituals performed. Their height and visibility gave them symbolic power. A tower on the horizon reminded everyone who controlled the valley. At the same time, their defensibility cannot be ignored. Narrow corridors, thick walls, and elevated terraces allowed defenders to repel enemies, whether rival clans or foreign raiders. The dual role of symbol and stronghold made the Nuraghi central to both daily life and collective imagination. Settlements clustered around these towers. Circular huts of stone and timber formed rings or neighborhoods, their arrangement often oriented toward the looming central structure. Life revolved around agriculture, herding, and metallurgy, but always within sight of the tower that embodied communal unity. From the first light of dawn until evening's close, villagers lived under the gaze of stone guardians. Children grew up playing in courtyards shadowed by towers, while elders measured memory and myth against the enduring stones. The most famous of these sites began to take shape at Barumini in central Sardinia. Known as Nuraghi, this complex would eventually expand into a fortress of staggering size, with a central tower over 18 meters tall, surrounded by 4 corner towers and encircled by defensive walls. In its earliest form, it was already a marvel, a central tholos tower whose presence commanded the surrounding plain. Centuries of expansion would transform it into one of the Mediterranean's great prehistoric monuments. But even at its birth, it demonstrated the scale of ambition Sardinian builders could achieve. The rise of Nuraghi reshaped social geography. Where earlier villages were scattered, now territories began to center on towers. Some Nuraghi stood alone, symbols of single communities, while others formed networks, suggesting territorial organization and hierarchies of power. Scholars speak of a landscape where each tower marked both a home and a claim, turning Sardinia into a mosaic of fortified communities. From ridge to valley, from coast to interior, stone towers anchored human presence in ways visible to all. The technology behind corbelled construction was not uniquely Sardinian. Similar methods appear in Mycenaean tholos tombs, but nowhere else were they applied at such scale or number. Sardinian builders adapted and extended the technique, creating monuments of singular identity. Their achievement testifies to both ingenuity and stubborn will, for each tower required not only knowledge, but endurance, as generations maintained and expanded them. The fact that thousands still stand today, weathered but unbowed, is proof of their remarkable construction. What drove communities to such effort? Defense against rivals, prestige in competition, sacred symbolism, likely all. The Nuraghi embodied many functions at once. Their commanding views provided security, but their prominence also spoke of status. They may have served as markers of lineage, seats of leadership, or even sanctuaries where ritual met politics. In this way, they were not only buildings, but embodiments of social identity. To belong to a community with a Nuraghi was to be part of something greater than the individual. The Middle Bronze Age thus witnessed a profound transformation. Sardinia, once defined by tombs and altars, now defined itself through towers. The landscape became monumentalized, every valley echoing with the presence of stone. These Nuraghi did not arise in isolation, but as part of a broader shift, from egalitarian villages to stratified communities, from scattered hamlets to organized territories, from simple shelters to architectural marvels that still astonish. Each tower was both a house of stone and a house of power. As the sun set over fields of barley and pastures dotted with sheep, the towers glowed red in the fading light. Their shadows stretched long across the land, uniting earth and sky in silent testimony. They were more than watchtowers. They were promises. Around them, villages would grow, rituals would deepen, and networks of trade and alliance would spread. The Nuraghi announced that Sardinia had entered a new epoch, not fleeting, but monumental. In stone, the island had found its enduring voice. Smoke curled into the sky above stone towers, drifting from the hearths of huts clustered around their bases. Sheep bleated in nearby fields. Goats picked their way across rocky slopes, and the steady thud of hammers on bronze echoed from shaded workshops. The Nuragic world is often remembered for its towers, but its true heartbeat lay in the lives of the villagers who built, sustained, and guarded them. To step into one of these settlements was to enter a world where stone, fire, and earth combined in a rhythm as old as the island itself. The villages spread outward from the Nuraghi, like rings around a fire. Low, circular houses formed clusters linked by narrow alleys, their walls built of local stone, their roofs woven from timber and reeds. Each hut held a hearth at its center, the heart of domestic life. Here families gathered at day's end, eating bread baked from barley or wheat ground on hand mills. In winter, fires crackled against the chill. In summer, doors stood open to let breezes chase away smoke. These homes, humble in size but enduring in design, were the stage on which daily life unfolded. Fields lay beyond the huts, divided into plots where families grew grain, legumes, and grapes. Barley and wheat fed the population, their cycles of sowing and harvest structuring the year. Lentils, peas, and beans added sustenance, while vines produced grapes that could be eaten fresh or fermented into wine for feasting. Harvest time was both labor and celebration, a season when communities gathered to cut grain, thresh it on flat rock surfaces, and store it in communal silos. The fertility of fields was a matter of survival, and every mouthful of bread testified to the labor of many hands. Animal husbandry was no less vital. Sheep and goats roamed the hills, providing wool, milk, and meat. Their bleating herds became the soundtrack of the countryside. Cattle, larger and rarer, supplied both labor and prestige, their strength pulling plows through rocky soils. Pigs rooted in oak groves and village edges, their meat filling storehouses and providing fat for cooking. Animals were wealth as much as sustenance, tokens of status and bargaining tools in marriage and alliance. Festivals often culminated in shared slaughter and feasting, reinforcing bonds through the act of eating together. Metal gave the Nuragic world its distinctive edge. In village workshops, bronze workers tended furnaces that roared with bellows, their fires hot enough to melt copper and tin. Molds of clay or stone shaped the molten mixture into tools, ornaments, and weapons. The hiss of cooling bronze marked the moment when raw materials became objects of use or prestige. A new sickle meant more efficient harvests. A new dagger marked its owner as a man of influence. Metallurgy was both craft and spectacle, drawing eyes to the glowing fires that seemed to harness lightning itself. Pottery remained an everyday necessity. Women shaped clay into jars, bowls, and storage vessels, decorating them with patterns both simple and elaborate. In kitchens, these pots simmered stews of lentils and goat meat. In storerooms, they held grain, wine, and oil. Textiles, too, emerged from domestic labor. Wool from sheep became yarn, spun on simple spindles, then woven on vertical looms into cloth for garments and blankets. These tasks, though repetitive, carried artistry. Dyed threads, woven patterns, and carefully balanced forms testified to skill passed through generations. Family life revolved around these cycles of labor. Children grew into roles early, learning to herd goats or spin wool long before adulthood. Elders preserved memory, recounting tales of ancestors and teaching rituals that bound communities to their gods. Women commanded the hearth, spinning, weaving, cooking, and tending children, while also managing the rhythms of planting and storage. Men often spent days in fields or mines, or tending the fires of the forge. Yet in times of harvest, construction, or war, all joined together in collective effort. Communal labor bound them more tightly than kinship alone. Life around the towers was not static, but full of movement. Herds shifted with seasons, moving from valleys in winter to uplands in summer. Traders arrived from distant coasts, carrying exotic goods in exchange for Sardinian metals and crafted wares. Festivals punctuated the calendar, moments when the monotony of labor gave way to song, dance, and feasting. These gatherings offered more than pleasure. They reaffirmed community, sealed alliances, and honored gods whose favor sustained crops and herds. The joy of shared wine and roasted meat balanced the hardships of toil and scarcity. Inequality found expression in these daily rhythms. Some huts were larger, some families richer in animals or bronze. Chiefs or elders held authority, their prestige reflected in feasts they hosted or weapons they displayed. Yet community remained essential. No tower could stand, no harvest succeed without cooperation. Even the most powerful depended on the labor of ordinary villagers. Authority, while real, rested on fragile balances of obligation and reciprocity, renewed daily in the fields, forges, and hearths of the village. Historical traces reveal both the material and the intangible. Grinding stones worn smooth by years of use speak of endless cycles of bread making. Loom weights whisper of cloth woven on wooden frames. Bronze fragments testify to the dangers of casting, where one mistake could ruin weeks of work. Even the ashes of hearths, preserved in soil, remind us of families who gathered in warmth and smoke. These remains do not merely describe objects. They illuminate lives, voices, and stories etched into the island's stone and soil. In such villages, survival was never guaranteed, but resilience became tradition. Children learned skills from elders. Communities adapted to seasons. Rituals marked passages from birth to death. The Nuraghi may dominate the skyline, but without these rhythms of daily life, the towers would be empty shells. It was the people, their hands, their hopes, their endurance, who gave stone its meaning. Around fires at dusk, with towers looming against the stars, families forged not only their livelihoods, but the culture that would carry Sardinia forward. Across the rolling countryside of Sardinia, long mounds of stone stretch like the backs of slumbering beasts. These are the Tombe dei Giganti, the giants' graves, collective tombs where Nuragic communities laid their dead. Each structure begins with a burial chamber built of massive slabs covered by earth and stone, then fronted by a semicircular facade of upright pillars. Some are capped by a single towering stele carved with door-like openings. Though no giant bones were ever found, later generations believed such beings had once walked the island, their size explained by the scale of these monuments. Beneath these stones, the bones of ancestors gathered over centuries. Unlike the solitary burials of elites in other lands, the giants' graves held dozens, even hundreds of individuals. This collective approach reflected values rooted in kinship and community. The living entered the forecourt to leave offerings of food, drink, and small bronze objects, acknowledging that the dead continued to share in village life. The act of burial was not the end, but a continuation, binding present generations to those who had built towers, tended flocks, and fought wars before them. Alongside tombs, water became a sacred element in the Nuragic imagination. Across the island, sanctuaries were built around springs and wells, their architecture carefully designed to frame liquid sources as portals to the divine. The best-known example lies at Santa Cristina, where a stairway of perfect symmetry descends into an underground chamber shaped like an inverted beehive. Here, water collects in still pools, reflecting the sky above. The precision of the masonry, stones cut to geometric accuracy, fitted seamlessly without mortar, reveals the importance of these sanctuaries as places where the human and divine met through water. At Santa Vittoria di Seri, a vast plateau sanctuary combined sacred wells, open-air temples, and gathering spaces large enough to host hundreds. Excavations have revealed traces of feasts, animal bones charred in cooking fires, fragments of pottery once filled with wine and grain. These events were not private rituals, but communal festivals, drawing people from surrounding valleys to honor gods, ancestors, and perhaps celestial forces. The sanctuaries served both religious and social purposes, uniting clans in shared ceremonies that reaffirmed alliances and identities. Within these sanctuaries, ritual centered on the offering of bronze figurines. Warriors with horned helmets, archers poised with bows, wrestlers caught in dynamic poses, mothers cradling infants. All were cast in miniature form, then dedicated to deities. The variety reflects the diversity of Nuragic society. Farmers, herders, fighters, and chiefs all found representation. Placed in wells, temples, or shrines, these votive figures served as petitions, thanks, or symbols of presence. Each one carried the identity of the person or group who offered it, turning sacred sites into archives of community life. Solar and astral alignments add further layers to this sacred landscape. Some wells and temples were oriented so that equinox or solstice light entered chambers in precise ways. At certain times of year, the rising or setting sun illuminated stairways or reflected directly in the still water below. Such alignments suggest a cosmology where the rhythms of sky and earth intertwined. Rituals performed at these moments would have reinforced the connection between human communities and the greater order of the cosmos. To gather at a sanctuary when the sun struck just so was to witness time itself sanctified. The Megaron temples, rectangular buildings with central hearths, introduced another architectural form into the Nuragic religious repertoire. Often built within sanctuary complexes, they echoed Mycenaean designs but adapted them to local needs. Inside, rituals unfolded around fire, with benches along the walls for participants and altars for offerings. Their presence reveals contact with broader Mediterranean traditions, while demonstrating Sardinia's ability to integrate foreign ideas into its own symbolic world. Far from isolated, Nuragic religion was dynamic, blending local and external influences into distinctive forms. Feasting formed the social heart of these rituals. Excavated refuse tells stories as clearly as texts might elsewhere. Bones of sheep and cattle split for marrow, pottery jars that once held wine, hearths built large enough to roast entire animals. Such gatherings transformed sacred sites into places of abundance, where sharing food reinforced bonds of kinship and obligation. Leaders who sponsored feasts displayed both generosity and power, feeding allies and rivals alike under the gaze of gods. In this way, ritual combined with politics, strengthening authority while affirming communal ties. The giants' graves themselves often hosted ritual meals in their forecourts. Archaeologists have uncovered traces of ash, pottery, and food remains, suggesting that the living gathered to dine with the dead. To eat at the threshold of a tomb was to affirm continuity across generations, binding family lines to ancestral spirits. These practices reveal a worldview where boundaries between life and death blurred, and where memory was not abstract but grounded in stone, food, and shared experience. Each meal by a tomb reinforced the idea that community extended beyond the living. Across the island, sacred landscapes created a web of meaning. Tombs dotted hillsides, sanctuaries clustered near springs, and temples crowned plateaus. Villages and towers stood within sight of these places, their daily rhythms framed by the presence of sacred stone. A shepherd guiding goats past a giant's grave, a woman drawing water from a sacred well, a craftsman dedicating a bronze figurine. All participated in a culture where religion permeated every act. The sacred was not confined to special times or spaces. It was woven into life itself. Ritual also provided a means of resolving conflict. Pilgrimage-like gatherings at sanctuaries allowed clans from different valleys to meet under divine sanction. Here, disputes could be settled, marriages arranged, and alliances forged. The authority of gods lent weight to agreements, while the presence of the wider community enforced them. The sanctuaries thus became not only religious centers, but also arenas of diplomacy, places where spiritual and political life converged. In this way, faith underpinned the stability of Nuragic society. The symbolism of horned helmets, seen in bronze figurines, likely carried religious significance as well. Horns, echoing cattle and rams, linked warriors to fertility and strength. To wear such a helmet in ritual or battle was to embody sacred power. The repetition of this motif in offerings suggests that martial identity and religious symbolism were deeply intertwined. Warfare, fertility, and divinity merged in a single image, reinforcing the idea that every aspect of life participated in a sacred order. Through these practices, the Nuragic world created a spiritual geography as enduring as its towers. Tombs preserved the ancestors, wells honored the power of water, temples aligned with stars, and sanctuaries hosted feasts that joined community and cosmos. Religion was not a separate domain, but the framework within which all life unfolded. Stone and sky, fire and water, feast and death, all carried meaning, all reinforced bonds that sustained villages and clans. The sacred landscape was therefore not static, but alive with voices and footsteps. Each ritual renewed connections across generations. Each offering carried the hopes of families. Each feast affirmed the unity of a people. To walk through Sardinia during this age was to encounter monuments that spoke of belief and belonging at every turn. And while these practices honored the gods, they also prepared the ground for the next great expression of identity. The warriors of bronze who would carry Nuragic culture into legend, the villages clustered around stone towers. The clang of bronze rang out as weapons struck shields in practice and ritual. Spears leaned against hut walls, swords glimmered in the firelight, and helmets adorned with horns transformed fighters into figures half human, half mythic. The Nuragic world was not only a society of farmers and herders, it was a culture that placed warriors at the center of its imagination. To live in these centuries was to measure status not only by land and livestock, but by courage, weaponry, and the ability to defend one's community. Weapons fashioned in bronze became the defining tools of this martial identity. Spears, with socketed bronze heads fixed to long wooden shafts, served both hunting and warfare. They allowed warriors to keep enemies at a distance or strike from behind walls. Daggers, small but potent, were worn at the belt as everyday symbols of manhood and readiness. Shields of wood and hide, sometimes reinforced with bronze fittings, turned aside blows and arrows. Yet the sword stood supreme, a weapon that required skill both to forge and to wield, and that carried with it an aura of prestige. To own a bronze sword in the Nuragic world was to carry proof of status. The evolution of sword design reveals Sardinia's place in the wider Bronze Age network. Early blades were simple, designed for thrusting. Later, Nuragic smiths adopted forms similar to the Naue II type, with leaf-shaped blades suited to both cut and thrust. These designs spread across the Mediterranean, from Greece to Italy, suggesting shared ideas and possibly shared conflicts. The fact that such swords appear in Sardinia demonstrates how deeply the island was integrated into the martial technologies of the age. Each new sword type reflected not only craftsmanship, but awareness of trends beyond the island's shores. Helmets gave warriors their most striking appearance. The horned helmets, represented in bronze figurines, transformed the wearer into an almost supernatural figure. The horns evoked the power of bulls or rams, animals central to both economy and symbolism. To appear in battle with such a helmet was to embody strength and fertility as much as martial prowess. Figurines depict these helmets with exaggerated size, suggesting that the visual impact was as important as practical use. Even if such helmets were rare in actual combat, their image carried weight in ritual, ceremony, and memory. The warrior ethos permeated daily life. Young men trained with weapons, learning to hurl spears, parry with shields, and fight in close formation. Songs and stories celebrated bravery, while cowardice brought dishonor, not only to the individual, but to his family. Chiefs gathered retinues of loyal fighters bound by oaths, much as later Mediterranean warlords would. A man's standing depended not only on wealth, but on the loyalty of those willing to fight at his side. In a landscape dotted with towers and rival communities, the ability to muster warriors determined survival. Nuraghi themselves played central roles in warfare. Their thick walls and narrow entrances made them formidable strongholds. In times of conflict, villagers could retreat behind stone defenses, while warriors held terraces and arrow slits against attackers. Multi-towered complexes functioned as fortresses, where defenders had both height and protection. At the same time, the visibility of Nuraghi across the land made them deterrents. A tower standing on a ridge was not only a home, but a warning. Here is a community capable of building, fighting, and enduring. Conflict likely occurred on multiple scales. Clans may have fought over pasture, water, or trade routes. Rival chiefs competed for prestige, sometimes sealing alliances with marriage, sometimes with blood. Raids would have targeted herds or granaries, striking at the wealth that sustained communities. Defensive networks of Nuraghi suggest that warfare was a persistent possibility, even if not constant. The martial ethos was less about permanent conflict than about readiness. the cultivation of an identity in which every man was potentially a fighter. Evidence of this warrior identity survives most vividly in bronze figurines. Hundreds have been found at sanctuaries and shrines, cast as offerings to gods. They depict archers with bows drawn, chiefs holding staffs, boxers with fists raised, and above all, warriors bearing shields and swords. Their detail is remarkable. Helmets with horns, belts decorated with patterns, weapons rendered in careful proportion. These miniatures were more than art. They were prayers in metal, tokens of devotion, and celebrations of martial life. Each figurine placed at a sanctuary declared that the community honored its fighters as embodiments of strength. Martial symbolism extended into ritual. Weapons were not only tools of war, but objects of offering. Bronze swords and spearheads have been found in sacred wells and temples, deliberately deposited as gifts to the gods. To cast a weapon into water or bury it at a shrine was to sacrifice value in exchange for divine favor. These acts reveal that warfare and religion were deeply connected. The strength of a fighter was believed to depend not only on skill, but on the blessing of supernatural powers. The chief, surrounded by warriors, occupied a position where politics and warfare merged. His ability to defend his people gave legitimacy to his authority. Feasts hosted by leaders often highlighted martial success, with warriors honored at the table for their deeds in battle or for the loyalty they had shown. Storytelling, perhaps accompanied by music, immortalized these acts, ensuring that memory of valor carried across generations. The community's identity was shaped not only by its towers and fields, but by the courage of those who fought for them. The warrior ethos also structured gender roles. Men were expected to train, fight, and defend, while women sustained the domestic and economic base. Yet the presence of female figurines, often depicted as priestesses or mothers, suggests that women participated in the symbolic balance that underpinned warfare. They maintained the households, produced textiles for armor and clothing, and raised the next generation of fighters. Their role, though less visible in martial display, was essential in sustaining the system. Bronze technology itself reinforced martial values. The process of smelting, casting, and shaping required knowledge, patience, and cooperation. Each sword or spearhead represented hours of labor, from mining ore to stoking furnaces. Weapons thus embodied collective effort as much as individual valor. To carry a bronze sword was to bear the work of miners, smiths, and families who had contributed to its making. In this sense, the warrior was not an isolated figure, but the visible tip of a society that invested heavily in martial identity. As Sardinia's connections to the wider Mediterranean deepened, so too did its martial culture. Imported objects and foreign styles influenced weaponry, armor, and tactics. The adoption of Naue II swords is one example. Another lies in parallels between Nuragic horned helmets and iconography found in Egyptian records of the Sea Peoples. While the exact nature of these connections remains debated, the evidence points to a culture that saw itself as part of a larger martial world, adapting and responding to the forces around it. Warfare was not constant, but its possibility shaped every aspect of Nuragic life. Villages clustered around Nuraghi because defense mattered. Chiefs gained power because they could lead fighters. Rituals honored warriors because their courage sustained the community. The martial ethos permeated identity, ensuring that every sword cast, every helmet worn, every figurine offered carried weight far beyond its physical form. The warrior was at once protector, symbol, and sacred offering. This martial identity gave Sardinia resilience. Across centuries of change, the image of the armed figure persisted. In bronze, in stone, and in story, the warrior became the emblem of the Nuragic people. He stood at the gate of the Nuraghi, at the altar of the sanctuary, and in the imagination of the community. More than a fighter, he was a statement that this island was strong, united, and enduring. Soon, these same warriors would turn their gaze outward, taking to the sea where Sardinia's strength would meet the wider world. Winds pressed against the sails of small but sturdy vessels as they left Sardinia's harbours, carrying men who knew the moods of the Tyrrhenian sea. Nets dried on beaches, oxhide-shaped ingots gleamed in cargo holds, and amphorae rattled as waves struck the hulls. These journeys were more than commerce. They were lifelines linking the island's towers to distant shores. The Nuragic world, so rooted in stone and soil, was equally a world of salt and water. From these coasts, Sardinia reached out to the Mediterranean, and the Mediterranean reached back. Sardinia's position made it unavoidable for sailors moving between Italy, Iberia, and North Africa. Harbours tucked into coves gave safe refuge, while mountains visible from far out at sea offered landmarks for navigation. For Nuragic chiefs, this geography meant opportunity. Ships could depart carrying copper, tin, and obsidian, returning with pottery, jewellery, and ideas. The sea was no barrier, but a thoroughfare, turning villages into participants in networks that stretched across the Bronze Age world. Copper remained the island's most coveted resource. Mines at Fontana Raminosa and other sites supplied ore that, when combined with tin, produced bronze, the essential alloy of the age. Sardinian copper has been identified in oxide ingots discovered far from the island, their chemical signatures tying them to these mines. Such ingots, flat and shaped like stretched hides, were easily stacked and transported. Their presence in shipwrecks and foreign ports shows that Sardinia was no isolated community, but a significant player in the commerce that fueled Bronze Age economies. Obsidian, though less dominant than in earlier millennia, continued to travel in these networks, its glossy black edges still cut with unmatched sharpness, making it useful for tools and rituals alike. Sardinian obsidian has been found in sites along the Italian peninsula and beyond, showing that this older trade remained valuable even as bronze defined the new era. Alongside metals, Nuragic craftsmen exported finely made goods, bronze figurines, decorated ceramics, and tools that carried the island's identity into foreign households and shrines. Contacts with the wider Mediterranean are visible in imported artifacts. At the site of Antigori in southern Sardinia, archaeologists uncovered Mycenaean pottery mingled with local wares. These vessels, brought from Greece, testify to direct or indirect contact with the Aegean world. Mycenaean traders, perhaps seeking metals, found Sardinia a willing partner. In exchange, they offered goods whose foreign styles became prized possessions in Nuragic villages. Such finds reveal a dialogue of cultures, each borrowing from the other while retaining distinct traditions. Cypriot and Levantine links are also suggested by fragments of ceramics and metallurgical techniques. The art of bronze casting shows parallels with Eastern practices, indicating that knowledge as well as material traveled along these routes. Ships leaving Sardinia did not simply return with goods. They carried new methods, fashions, and ideas. The island, though distant from the great palaces of the East, absorbed and adapted innovations brought by sailors who touched its shores. The Egyptian records add a tantalizing dimension. In inscriptions and reliefs, pharaohs described attacks by the Sea Peoples, confederations of warriors who struck across the eastern Mediterranean around the 12th century before Christ. Among the names listed appear the Shardana, depicted with horned helmets and round shields. weapons familiar from Nuragic figurines. Some scholars argue that these Shardana were Sardinians, seafarers who joined the great upheavals that toppled empires. Others caution that the name may have broader meanings, or that mercenaries from Sardinia served in foreign armies without representing the island as a whole. Whatever the truth, the resemblance remains striking, and the possibility ties Sardinia to one of the most dramatic episodes of the Bronze Age. Theories about Nuragic participation in these movements vary. One view holds that Sardinian warriors, renowned for skill and daring, joined coalitions that raided and settled in distant lands. Another suggests that only a fraction left, while most communities continued their lives around Nuraghi and fields. Yet even the cautious interpretations accept that Sardinia's reputation had spread widely, far enough that Egyptian scribes knew of fighters with horned helmets. Whether as allies, mercenaries, or invaders, Sardinian seafarers left impressions beyond their shores. Seafaring was not only about warfare or long-distance raids. Everyday voyages carried grain, livestock, and people between communities. Chiefs sought to control harbors as much as they controlled fields, knowing that access to the sea meant access to wealth. Some Nuraghi stood within sight of coasts, their towers signaling both defense and welcome to incoming ships. From these vantage points, watchmen scanned horizons for sails, distinguishing friends from strangers. A boat appearing at dawn could mean new trade or sudden threat. Maritime skills were handed down through generations. Knowledge of currents, winds, and stars guided sailors long before compasses existed. Simple square sails, combined with oars, allowed ships to move with flexibility, hugging coasts or striking across open waters. Fishing complemented longer journeys, ensuring crews had sustenance. Boat building itself became a respected craft, using oak and pine shaped with bronze tools. Each vessel embodied both technical skill and cultural pride, carrying with it the hopes of the community that launched it. The social meaning of seafaring was profound. A chief who controlled a successful harbor commanded more than local loyalty. He held a gateway to the wider world. Foreign goods enhanced prestige. An imported jar or ornament displayed in a feast proclaimed connections far beyond the village. Warriors who had traveled abroad returned with stories of distant lands, enriching the oral traditions that bound communities. Maritime contact thus shaped identity, giving Nuragic society a confidence that came from being part of larger currents. Yet the sea also brought danger. Foreign powers coveted Sardinia's resources, and maritime wealth invited rivalry. Encounters with Etruscans, Phoenicians, and Greeks would later intensify this tension. But even in the Bronze Age, the possibility of piracy and skirmish was real. Harbors could as easily host raiders as traders, and villages near the coast remained vigilant. The dual nature of the sea, as opportunity and threat, defined Sardinia's maritime world. Archaeological traces reinforce this complexity. Bronze models of ships found among votive offerings reveal how deeply maritime life entered the spiritual realm. These miniatures, often detailed with oars and sails, were dedicated at sanctuaries, perhaps as prayers for safe voyages or thanks for successful journeys. To offer a ship in bronze was to acknowledge that the sea was not entirely under human control. Divine favor was sought for every departure and every return. In the broader Mediterranean, Sardinia's role was recognized through exchange and perhaps fear. Its metals fueled industries abroad, its warriors gained reputation, and its ships became familiar on trading routes. The island, though small compared to Egypt or Mycenae, stood out as a hub of resources and resilience. Its seafaring people balanced the demands of agriculture at home with the risks of voyaging abroad. weaving both land and sea into their identity. Nuragic Sardinia thus emerges not as an isolated culture, but as a maritime participant in a vast, interconnected world. Its towers watched over fields, but its ships carried the island's presence far beyond sight of shore. In the rhythm of waves and the creak of timbers lay both prosperity and peril. The same warriors who defended Nuraghi on land steered vessels across waters, extending Sardinian influence into the Mediterranean currents of trade, conflict, and migration. From these journeys came wealth, reputation, and stories that shaped the generations to follow. And with seafaring established, Sardinia stood prepared for the next stage, a society of increasing complexity, where federations and power centers would redefine the balance of the island. Villages that once lived in the shadow of single towers began to find themselves bound together in larger webs of stone and allegiance. Where one Nuragh had guarded a valley, now a chain of towers dotted ridges and plains, each one visible from the next, signaling strength across the horizon. Communities that had once acted alone were increasingly drawn into federations, collections of villages that recognized common chiefs and shared responsibilities. The island was shifting, not by sudden revolution, but through steady accumulation of bonds that turned scattered households into organized polities. In many valleys, one great Nuragh rose above the rest, a monumental keep surrounded by smaller towers that formed a constellation of stone. The largest structure served as the seat of authority, its walls thicker, its chambers grander, its commanding views wider. Around it, secondary Nuraghi marked the limits of territory, each one echoing the power of the central fortress. This pattern suggests not randomness, but planning, the work of leaders who wanted not only to defend their villages, but also to claim and organize land on a scale never seen before. The building of such complexes required more than enthusiasm. Dozens of men labored for weeks to drag blocks into place, while others harvested and stored grain to feed the workers. Cattle and sheep were slaughtered to sustain the effort. Women spun cloth to clothe the builders, and elders oversaw rituals to bless the project. Construction itself became a community act, uniting multiple households under the leadership of chiefs who could command both labor and loyalty. Each stone lifted into a wall was also a statement of political will. These emerging leaders were not kings in the sense of distant empires, but their power was real. They gathered tribute in livestock, grain, or crafted goods. They judged disputes between families and villages, their word backed by both custom and force. They led warriors in times of raid or defense, their horned helmets gleaming as they stood before their followers. In return, they were expected to provide feasts, to mediate between clans, and to honor the gods with offerings made in the name of the whole community. Authority was both privilege and burden, constantly renewed through action. Some scholars describe this system as cantonal, suggesting that Sardinia became divided into districts, each dominated by a major complex. Whether or not this term fully captures the reality, the archaeological record shows clear hierarchies. Great Nuraghi, like Santu Antine or Losa, dominated their regions, while smaller towers filled supporting roles. Lines of sight connected them, so that smoke, fire, or signal could pass quickly from one to another, warning of threat or summoning allies. Territory was no longer defined only by fields and flocks, but by networks of stone that bound communities together. The distribution of power also reshaped daily life. Families still tended goats and sheep, still sowed barley and wheat, still wove wool into cloth, but now their efforts contributed to larger systems. Grain might be collected for storage in great silos, ready to feed warriors or laborers on communal projects. Livestock could be driven to central feasts that reinforced the bonds between villages. Bronze objects, once exchanged in small circles, now circulated under the authority of chiefs who controlled trade routes and harbour access. The rhythms of life remained, but the scale had grown. Gatherings at major complexes became events of importance. Villages from surrounding hills converged on the central tower to attend feasts, resolve disputes, or prepare for collective defense. In courtyards and open spaces, warriors displayed their weapons, craftsmen showed their work, and priests oversaw rituals at shrines. These occasions allowed leaders to demonstrate their generosity and their ability to marshal resources. A chief who could feed hundreds from his stores of grain and herds commanded respect not only for his wealth, but for his capacity to safeguard the community. The architecture itself tells of this increasing complexity. Multi-towered Nuraghi, with bastions and courtyards dwarfed earlier single keeps. Within their walls, staircases spiraled upward, linking terraces that provided commanding views. Wells supplied water, even during sieges, while storerooms held grain and weapons. Villages around them grew larger, sometimes numbering hundreds of inhabitants, with clusters of huts arranged in ordered patterns. The scale suggests planning and authority, for such organization required more than casual effort. Each settlement became a small world, bound to others through alliances that stretched across valleys and mountains. Bronze figurines from this period often depict not lone warriors, but leaders surrounded by attendants, or groups of fighters standing in formation. These images echo the reality of a society no longer defined solely by individual households, but by collective structures. Identity expanded beyond the family to encompass the territory, the canton, the federation. A man was not only son of his father, but also member of a broader community, marked by its great tower and its alliances with neighbors. The sense of belonging widened even as rivalries persisted. Rivalries did not vanish. Competition between federations was fierce, each one guarding its territory and trade. Yet warfare now took place within a framework of recognized centers, with boundaries understood and defended. Conflict could flare into raids or escalate into prolonged struggles, but the existence of organized power centers meant that victories and defeats carried wider consequences. Alliances shifted, federations rose and fell, and through it all the landscape of towers bore witness to the ebb and flow of influence. The spread of sanctuaries during this time also reflects the new complexity. Great religious centers drew pilgrims from multiple territories, serving as neutral grounds where federations could meet. Here, bronze figurines were offered in abundance, and communal feasts reinforced ties that extended beyond local rivalries. The overlap of political and sacred authority strengthened the position of chiefs, who presented themselves as both protectors of their people and mediators with the gods. In this way, religion and politics intertwined, each lending legitimacy to the other. Sardinia, during the late Bronze Age, was thus a land of networks, of stone, of loyalty, of ritual. Towers marked territories, alliances linked valleys, sanctuaries united federations. Communities that had once been isolated hamlets had become parts of larger wholes, capable of collective action on scales unimaginable in earlier centuries. Yet this growing complexity also carried risks, for greater organization meant greater stakes in both prosperity and conflict. What had begun as villages clustering around stone towers had become something much larger, an island organized into federations of power, each with its own centers, its own leaders, its own networks of sacred and political authority. The landscape of Sardinia now spoke not only of survival, but of ambition, not only of community, but of identity projected on a grand scale. And as these federations grew stronger, so too did the sanctuaries and shrines that would soon dominate the spiritual life of the island, drawing its people together in gatherings that echoed with both devotion and politics. Within the federations that now organized Sardinia, sanctuaries rose as gathering places where religion, politics, and community life merged. These sites, built with the same precision of stonework seen in towers, offered spaces where people from many valleys could assemble in safety. Here, bronze smoke curled from altars, wells shimmered with sacred water, and the sounds of feasting carried into the night. The Nuragic world, defined by towers and warriors, found its unifying spirit in sanctuaries that anchored belief and bound people together. At Santa Cristina, one of the most remarkable sanctuaries, a stairway of perfect symmetry descended into a subterranean chamber. Cut from carefully dressed blocks, the stair led down to a spring whose still water mirrored the sky above. On solstice and equinox days, sunlight aligned precisely with the stair or reflected within the chamber, creating a spectacle that fused cosmic order with human design. Pilgrims arriving at Santa Cristina would have walked into a space where architecture, nature, and celestial rhythm converged. To draw water here was to partake in an act both practical and divine. Far to the south, on the plateau of Seri, the sanctuary of Santa Vittoria spread across open ground. Unlike the single focus wells of other shrines, this complex combined temples, assembly areas, and courtyards large enough to host hundreds. Traces of fires, discarded pottery, and animal bones reveal that large-scale feasts took place here. Communities gathered from wide regions, bringing grain, wine, and livestock to share in rituals that honored gods and renewed alliances. The sanctuary was not simply a place for prayer, but a center of political and social life, where decisions could be made and disputes settled under sacred sanction. Another jewel of Nuragic architecture lay at Su Tempiesu in the mountainous north. Built into a hillside, this sanctuary enclosed a spring within walls of stone that channeled water into basins. A sloping roof once covered the structure, protecting the sacred source while framing it for ritual use. Bronze figurines deposited here show warriors, priests, and animals, all offered in devotion. The setting, remote, enclosed, and meticulously built, emphasized the intimacy of the relationship between worshippers and water. Each site, though unique, shared the belief that divine power resided in springs, wells, and the careful architecture that revealed them. Pilgrimage-like gatherings at these sanctuaries created moments when everyday boundaries dissolved. Villages that might compete in the fields met as partners in feasting and ritual. Families camped near shrines, bringing goods to trade, songs to sing, and stories to share. Warriors arrived in full regalia, their weapons gleaming, while women carried woven cloth and jars of wine as offerings. Children grew up with memories of crowded courtyards, blazing fires, and ceremonies that linked their small communities to something vast. The sanctuaries became theaters of collective identity, places where the Nuragic people recognized themselves as part of a wider whole. The offerings left behind speak volumes. Bronze figurines depict every aspect of society. Warriors holding swords and shields, archers with bows taut, wrestlers grappling in frozen motion, mothers nursing infants, chiefs raising staffs of command. Each figure, often only a few inches tall, was carefully cast and dedicated, a miniature world of Nuragic life placed into divine keeping. These objects remind us that religion was not abstract, but grounded in the real. The gods received the same images that filled villages: fighters, leaders, families, herders, an acknowledgement that the sacred embraced every part of existence. Among the most evocative offerings are the bronze ship models. Crafted with meticulous detail, complete with prows, oars, and sometimes sails, they captured the maritime spirit of Sardinia. To dedicate a ship was to invoke divine favor for voyages, to thank for safe returns, or to honor the sea's central role in the island's life. These models blur the line between practical and symbolic, standing as prayers in metal that acknowledge the risks and rewards of seafaring. In them, the Nuragic people declared that their horizons extended beyond fields and towers, reaching across waters that connected them to distant worlds. Feasting played as crucial a role as offerings. The remains of cattle bones, sheep skulls, and charred hearths show that sacrifices were followed by shared meals. Chiefs used these events to demonstrate generosity, feeding allies and rivals alike. Wine, whether local or imported, flowed in abundance, while music and dancing turned ritual into celebration. The act of eating together, under the gaze of sacred wells and temples, reinforced the bonds of kinship and alliance. These feasts transformed religion into lived experience, binding spiritual devotion with the pleasures of food, song, and community. The sanctuaries also functioned as stages for political negotiation. When federations gathered, leaders exchanged gifts, arranged marriages, and confirmed agreements in the presence of gods. By tying politics to sacred ritual, they gave weight to their promises. A treaty sealed at a sanctuary was more than a pact between chiefs. It was an oath witnessed by divine powers. This intertwining of the sacred and the political ensured that sanctuaries stood at the center of Sardinia's life, not only as places of worship, but as engines of social cohesion. Architecture reflected this dual role. Sacred wells combined geometric perfection with symbolic meaning, their stairways and chambers guiding worshippers into spaces where light, water, and stone converged. Megaron temples offered enclosed halls where fire rituals took place, while open courtyards accommodated crowds for feasts and assemblies. Each form served a function, and together they created complexes where divine presence and human activity could coexist. The stone itself, cut and fitted with skill, proclaimed the same mastery seen in towers, but here directed toward the service of gods and community rather than defense. The sanctuary's distribution across Sardinia created a network of sacred sites. Each region had its own center, yet all shared common forms and practices, uniting the island through parallel traditions. Pilgrims traveling to distant shrines carried news and stories, weaving Sardinia into a cultural fabric as cohesive as its stone towers. The sanctuaries gave the Nuragic people a sense of shared identity that transcended local rivalries. To stand before the well at Santa Cristina or the plateau at Seri was to know oneself as part of something greater. Through these sanctuaries, the Nuragic world achieved a flowering of spiritual life as enduring as its towers. The dead lay in giants' graves, warriors guarded villages, chiefs commanded federations, but it was in shrines and wells that the community gathered as one. Here, bronze and stone met water and fire. Here, feasts sealed alliances. Here, ships were offered to unseen powers. The sanctuaries were not silent ruins, but living centers of devotion, diplomacy, and celebration. As these sacred places flourished, they prepared Sardinia for wider encounters. Foreign traders, arriving with pottery and goods, sometimes joined in the feasts. New ideas and objects flowed into shrines along with local offerings. The sanctuaries thus stood at the threshold between tradition and contact, mediating both the internal bonds of the Nuragic world and its growing ties to the Mediterranean. In their stones and offerings, we glimpse not only belief, but also the confidence of a people ready to face outsiders in both exchange and conflict. Sails rose on distant horizons, their silhouettes unlike the boats of Sardinia. Traders from other lands approached the island, drawn by its wealth in metals and its strategic harbours. For the Nuragic people, accustomed to life organized by towers and sanctuaries, these arrivals offered both opportunity and danger. Exchange brought wealth, but it also carried the possibility of rivalry and loss. The Bronze Age world was interconnected, and Sardinia, with its copper and skilled seafarers, stood firmly within its currents. Among the first consistent contacts were those with the Etruscan communities of the Italian peninsula. Etruscan ships crossed the Tyrrhenian, seeking metals to fuel their own workshops and to supply trade with the wider Mediterranean. Sardinian harbours became stopping points where copper and tin were exchanged for goods crafted in Italian workshops. Decorative bronzes, fine pottery, and ornaments flowed into Sardinia, where they became symbols of status in Nuragic villages. These exchanges created bonds of familiarity, though the competition for resources could just as easily turn neighbours into adversaries. Phoenician sailors, expert navigators from the Levant, also entered these waters. Their ships, larger and more sophisticated than many local vessels, carried purple-dyed textiles, glass beads, and exotic wares. To Nuragic chiefs, such goods were treasures that enhanced feasts and rituals. In return, the Phoenicians sought metals, livestock, and safe anchorages along Sardinia's coast. The encounters often began as trade, but tensions sometimes followed. Coastal communities had to decide whether visiting ships were welcome allies or dangerous rivals, and the line between guest and raider could be thin. Greek influence arrived in fragments at first, pottery from the Aegean found in Sardinian sites, echoes of myths that may have carried faint memories of voyages west. Mycenaean and later Greek traders recognized Sardinia's strategic position, a natural crossroads between east and west. In places like Antigori, fragments of Greek pottery reveal that exchange was more than occasional. Nuragic chiefs may have invited foreign sailors to feasts, sealing bonds with gifts of bronze in return for exotic ceramics and wine from distant vineyards. These interactions gave Sardinian society a taste of worlds beyond its shores. Bronze circulation tied Sardinia directly to the great networks of the age. Oxhide ingots, shaped like stretched hides, travelled in ships that linked Cyprus, Crete, and Italy. Chemical analysis of some ingots reveals Sardinian copper among them, proof that the island's resources were carried far afield. To hold one of these ingots was to grasp a token of global trade. A piece of Sardinia melted into the economy of distant kingdoms. Chiefs who controlled such trade gained power not only within their valleys, but across federations, their influence expanding with each shipment. Imported goods testify to the richness of these contacts. Mycenaean jars, Cypriot bronze tools, and Phoenician glass beads appear in Sardinian sites, often deposited in sanctuaries as offerings. Each object carried both practical and symbolic value. A Greek jar filled with wine could transform a feast, while a glass bead might adorn a chief's daughter, marking her as connected to foreign lands. When these items were placed before sacred wells or shrines, they became more than luxuries. They were acknowledgements that the gods themselves participated in the wider world. Conflict, however, was never far from commerce. Coastal raids occurred, whether by Nuragic seafarers seeking spoils or by outsiders testing local defenses. Some battles left traces in burned settlements or hurriedly abandoned stores. Nuraghi near the coast doubled as watchtowers, signaling danger from the sea. Warships, swift and narrow, could turn merchants into raiders in an instant. In such an environment, Sardinia's warrior ethos found new expression. Defending harbours and controlling trade routes became as important as protecting fields and herds inland. Bronze working itself shows signs of shared knowledge. Techniques of casting and design in Sardinia reflect influences from abroad, while Sardinian styles also travelled outward. The island's craftsmen were respected for their skill, and objects of Nuragic origin have been found beyond its shores. In this sense, the exchange was not one-sided. Sardinia contributed as much as it received, shaping the technologies and aesthetics of the Bronze Age world. To work bronze in a Nuragic village was to participate in a tradition that spanned from the Levant to Iberia. Rivalries between federations may have been sharpened by these foreign contacts. Chiefs competed for access to harbours and control of trade routes, knowing that wealth and prestige depended on the goods that flowed from ships. A community with secure ties to foreign traders could host feasts with imported wine, display ornaments from distant lands, and offer rare goods at sanctuaries. Such displays reinforced authority and drew followers, while rival chiefs risked being overshadowed. The arrival of foreigners thus amplified internal competition as much as external rivalry. Not all encounters were hostile. Some foreign sailors settled, marrying into local families, their descendants blending traditions. Stories and songs may have preserved memories of these unions, transforming strangers into ancestors. In sanctuaries, imported goods dedicated alongside local figurines suggest that foreigners participated in rituals, acknowledging the gods of Sardinia. These shared acts reveal that the boundary between outsider and insider could blur, creating hybrid communities enriched by exchange. The wider Mediterranean world was in flux during these centuries. Empires collapsed, trade networks shifted, and new powers rose to prominence. Sardinia, though distant from the palaces of the East, was not immune. Its metals, warriors, and harbours made it part of the turbulence. To be Nuragic was to live at the edge of both danger and opportunity, watching the sea not only for returning fishermen, but for sails that might bring wealth or war. The towers inland gave stability, but the sea offered both promise and peril. Through it all, Sardinia retained its identity. The Nuraghi still stood, villages still tended fields, sanctuaries still hosted feasts. But the presence of foreign goods in tombs, the memory of conflicts along coasts, and the spread of metallurgical techniques show that the island was increasingly entangled in the affairs of others. Its warriors defended, its craftsmen produced, its chiefs negotiated, all within a world where isolation was impossible. Sardinia's place in the Bronze Age was no longer that of a remote island. It had become a hub, a participant, a prize. As foreign sails came and went, the island grew more interconnected, more competitive, and more ambitious. Chiefs dreamed not only of guarding valleys, but of controlling routes and sanctuaries. Communities expanded their towers into vast complexes, seeking to match their political ambitions with monumental stone. In the generations that followed, these impulses would shape settlements of extraordinary scale, like Nuraghi at Barumini and the sprawling fortress of Santuantine. The age of contacts and conflicts had prepared Sardinia for the rise of its greatest centres. In the central plains of Sardinia, a tower rose taller than any built before. Block by block, stone was lifted into place until it stood 18 meters high, crowned by terraces that looked out across fields and ridges. Around it, 4 corner towers were added, then walls, then bastions, that turned the original keep into the heart of a fortress. Villages clustered outside these defenses, huts multiplying as generations expanded the settlement. This was Nuragic at Barumini, the most famous of Sardinia's Nuragic complexes, and one of the greatest monuments of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. The earliest builders at Barumini had raised a single tholos tower, massive in its own right, but over centuries, their descendants expanded it into a citadel. The central keep became the core of a quadrilobate fortress, each new tower attached to the old by thick walls. A ring of outer defenses enclosed the complex, with gates, stairways, and passages forming a labyrinth of stone. To walk within its walls was to enter a world designed for both awe and security, where architecture proclaimed the power of the community that built it. Nuragic was not unique. Across Sardinia, other sites reached similar levels of ambition. At Torralba, the great Nuraghi of Santu Antine rose like a stone crown above the plain. Its central tower, though slightly shorter than Barumini's, was equally impressive, and its bastions and passages earned it the nickname of Sardinia's Versailles. In the wilds of central Sardinia, the complex of Arubiu, known as the Red Giant, sprawled with 5 central towers and more than a dozen outer bastions, making it one of the largest fortresses ever constructed on the island. Each of these settlements represented not just architecture, but statements of power, visible symbols that declared the strength and ambition of their builders. Other sites added variety to this monumental landscape. The Nuraghi of Losa, with its elegant triangular bastions, stood as a testament to geometric precision. Palmavera, near Alghero, revealed a settlement where stone towers coexisted with long-standing huts, showing the integration of old and new forms. Each site tells its own story, but together they form a pattern. The Nuragic people, once content with single towers and small villages, had entered an age of great settlements, where scale and complexity redefined what it meant to live in community. Villages around these fortresses grew to house hundreds of inhabitants. Archaeologists estimate populations of 200 to 400 at some of the largest sites, far surpassing earlier hamlets. Clusters of circular huts formed neighborhoods connected by narrow lanes, while communal structures, larger and more elaborate, served for meetings or rituals. Some huts contained benches or hearths that suggest specialized functions, spaces for craftsmen, storage, or administration. Life in these villages was no longer merely subsistence. It had become organized, differentiated, and stratified. The building of such monumental complexes demanded immense communal labor. Hundreds of workers would have been required to quarry, transport, and set the stones. Organizing such projects meant leaders capable of commanding both resources and loyalty. Chiefs stood at the center of these efforts, directing construction, while feasts and rituals reinforced the unity of the workforce. The stone towers, rising higher each year, embodied the collective identity of communities whose members invested sweat and strength into structures that would outlast their own lifetimes. Water systems added further sophistication. Wells and cisterns were often integrated into these complexes, ensuring supplies even under siege. Channels and drains reveal attention to both defense and daily need. The ability to secure water within fortified walls meant that settlements could withstand attacks and drought alike. Such planning shows that these were not improvised strongholds, but carefully designed centers of power, blending practicality with symbolism. Within the courtyards and bastions, warriors drilled, chiefs held council, and rituals took place under the shadow of towers. The fortress was not only a defensive structure, but also a political and ceremonial center. Leaders used these spaces to display wealth, organize alliances, and command loyalty. A visitor approaching Nuraghi or Santu Antine would have been struck not only by the architecture, but by the human drama it housed. Warriors in horned helmets standing watch, craftsmen laboring at forges, priests preparing offerings, and villagers hurrying through gates with baskets of grain. The social implications of such settlements were profound. Hierarchy became more visible. Chiefs or leading families occupied prominent spaces within or near the fortresses, while ordinary households clustered in outer rings. Authority rested not only on descent, but on the ability to coordinate labor, manage surplus, and defend territory. The construction and maintenance of these complexes ensured that power was both visible and tangible, embodied in stone walls that loomed over the surrounding countryside. Feasts within these settlements confirmed and renewed bonds. Chiefs slaughtered cattle, opened jars of wine, and distributed food to warriors and villagers alike. The act of feeding the community reinforced authority as much as bronze swords or thick walls. These occasions also provided opportunities for diplomacy, as neighboring chiefs gathered to witness generosity, settle disputes, or arrange marriages. Within the courtyards of Great Nuraghi, politics unfolded as surely as they did in sanctuaries and shrines. Craft production flourished under the protection of these centers. Bronze, working, weaving, and pottery reached new levels of specialization. Workshops produced tools, ornaments, and weapons in greater numbers, supported by the surplus generated by organized agriculture and herding. The presence of imported goods, Greek pottery, Phoenician beads, and Etruscan bronzes, suggests that these settlements were also hubs of trade, where local and foreign objects mingled. Chiefs controlling such exchanges enhanced their prestige, displaying exotic items alongside local products to demonstrate their reach. The visual impact of these fortresses must have been extraordinary. Rising from plains or perched on ridges, their towers dominated the landscape. Travelers moving through Sardinia would have seen them from miles away, reminders that every valley was claimed and defended. Their sheer scale made them both practical defenses and symbols of permanence, proclaiming that the Nuragic people were not transient but rooted, capable of achievements equal to any of their Mediterranean neighbors. For the villagers who lived in their shadow, these settlements provided both security and identity. To belong to Nuraghi or Santu Antine was to share in the prestige of its towers. The walls protected crops and herds, but they also created a sense of belonging, of community bound together by stone. Children grew up hearing stories of the tower's construction, playing in courtyards that echoed with footsteps of generations, and absorbing a sense of pride that tied them to both ancestors and descendants. These great settlements mark the high point of Nuragic ambition. They combined defense, politics, ritual, and community in ways that elevated Sardinia beyond earlier ages of scattered towers and villages. Their stones still stand, mute witnesses to a society that achieved complexity without kings or empires, through the collective efforts of federations and chiefs. Yet even as these monuments rose, the wider world trembled. The Bronze Age across the Mediterranean was entering a period of collapse, and the connections that had brought wealth and ideas to Sardinia were about to unravel. The towers at Barumini, Santu Antine, and Arubiu stood ready, but the storm of change approached. The Nuragic people, secure in their fortresses, would would soon face challenges that stone alone could not withstand. Beyond the western horizon, empires and kingdoms that had long defined the Bronze Age began to crumble. Mycenaean palaces burned, the Hittite state fractured, and Egyptian records spoke of invasions that shook even the Nile Valley. Trade routes that once carried copper, tin, and luxury goods faltered, and ships that had once crowded Mediterranean waters grew fewer. For Sardinia, linked to this wider world through metals and seafaring, the collapse brought both danger and transformation. The island's chiefs, who had grown accustomed to welcoming foreign traders, now saw fewer sails in their harbours. Imported pottery and beads became scarce, and the flow of bronze ingots diminished. Without the constant pulse of exchange, communities turned inward. Surplus, once intended for export, now sustained local networks, and prestige shifted from control of foreign goods to the ability to manage resources within the island. The collapse of long-distance commerce reshaped Sardinia's priorities. Settlements adapted in visible ways. Coastal sites that had thrived on maritime contact saw decline, their towers less frequently repaired, their villages shrinking. In contrast, hilltop settlements gained importance. Perched on ridges and mountains, these new centers offered both security and oversight of surrounding valleys. From their vantage points, inhabitants could watch for raiders or rival federations, ready to defend their land in uncertain times. The shift inland reflected both practical defense and the loss of incentive to dwell by harbors that no longer connected to busy routes. The Nuraghi themselves tell the story of this transformation. Some of the largest complexes, such as Barumini and Santuantine, remained occupied, their walls maintained by communities that still drew strength from their monumental heritage. Others were abandoned or repurposed. Towers no longer expanded into vast fortresses, but were used for more modest needs: shelter, storage, or local defense. Construction slowed, and the energy once devoted to building monumental settlements redirected towards sustaining daily life. The great age of expansion had passed, replaced by one of consolidation and endurance. Economic life adjusted to the new reality. Agriculture continued to provide grain, grapes, and legumes, while herds of sheep, goats, and cattle remained the foundation of wealth. Metalwork persisted, but bronze became harder to procure without steady tin supplies from abroad. Craftsmen adapted by recycling old objects, melting broken tools and weapons into new forms. The skill of metallurgy did not vanish, but its scale narrowed. Pottery, weaving, and local crafts remained steady, serving communities that could no longer rely on external luxuries. Despite the contraction of trade, sanctuaries and shrines continued to play vital roles. Offerings of bronze figurines and ship models persisted, though in smaller numbers, suggesting that rituals carried on even in leaner times. Feasting at sites like Santa Vittoria di Seri provided continuity, a reminder that the gods had not abandoned the people. In moments of uncertainty, religion anchored identity, reinforcing ties that outlasted the collapse of distant empires. Pilgrimages may have become more regional, but they still drew communities together, sustaining the spiritual core of Nuragic life. Signs of abandonment appear in the archaeological record: villages deserted, towers left unfinished, fields neglected. Yet these were not signs of total collapse. Other areas reveal continuity, with settlements reorganized rather than destroyed. Some Nuraghi remained in use well into the first millennium before Christ, while others were adapted into new forms of habitation. The pattern suggests resilience. Sardinia absorbed the shock of global crisis, retreating from outward expansion but preserving its cultural heart. Conflict likely intensified during this period. With fewer external opportunities, rival federations may have turned against each other, competing for land, herds, and control of sanctuaries. Hilltop fortifications, clustered towers, and evidence of hurried defenses all point to heightened insecurity. Raids and skirmishes would have tested the warrior ethos, demanding vigilance even in times of scarcity. The island's identity as a society of fighters, already strong, became even more pronounced in the face of internal and external threats. Memory of foreign connections lingered. Imported objects, cherished as heirlooms, were displayed in feasts and passed down through generations. Stories of voyages and alliances lived on in oral tradition, even as the reality of such contacts grew distant. Sardinia did not forget the wider world, but it survived by focusing on itself. The skills of seafaring remained, but ships were used more for local journeys than for ambitious expeditions across seas that had grown dangerous and unpredictable. The late Bronze Age in Sardinia was therefore a time of transformation rather than simple decline. Monumental buildings slowed, trade contracted, and society turned inward. But communities endured. The towers still stood, sanctuaries still drew pilgrims, and warriors still guarded valleys. Change was real, but it did not erase identity. Instead, it reshaped it, forcing Sardinians to adapt to a world where the great powers of the East had fallen silent. As the centuries passed, the island adjusted to its new place. While elsewhere, cities lay in ruins and kingdoms vanished, Sardinia's villages survived. When foreign sails once again appeared on the horizon, this time belonging to Phoenician traders seeking new opportunities, the Nuragic people were ready to meet them. The crisis of the Bronze Age had tested their endurance, and their response prepared them for the encounters and challenges of the Iron Age to come. The horizon once again filled with sails, but these belonged not to Mycenaeans or wandering raiders. From the east came the Phoenicians, master sailors from the Levant, whose ships stitched together the Mediterranean with routes of trade and colonies. Their arrival on Sardinia's shores in the 9th and 8th centuries before Christ marked the beginning of a new era. Where the collapse of the Bronze Age had left harbours quiet, now foreign tongues returned to the docks, and goods from far-off lands flowed once more into Nuragic hands. The Phoenicians came not as conquerors, but as merchants. Their ships carried purple-dyed textiles, fine pottery, glass beads, and exotic ornaments. For Nuragic chiefs, these goods offered prestige, transforming feasts and sanctuaries with luxuries unseen for generations. In return, the Phoenicians sought copper, silver, livestock, and above all, secure places to anchor their ships. Trade was their lifeblood, and Sardinia's coasts, rich with harbours and close to routes linking east and west, became natural stopping points in their expanding network. Early encounters were shaped by curiosity and pragmatism. Nuragic villagers welcomed the chance to exchange surplus for exotic wares, while Phoenicians appreciated local hospitality and safe moorings. Feasts may have sealed these first arrangements, with foreign sailors sitting beside chiefs in courtyards lit by fires, sharing wine and roasted meat. Marriages between local families and foreign merchants likely followed, binding strangers into kinship. Over time, small trading posts grew into permanent settlements, places where Phoenicians built their own houses and temples beside the towers of Sardinia. Nora, on the southern coast, became one of the earliest and most prominent Phoenician foundations. Here, stone houses and sanctuaries rose near Nuragic villages, creating a landscape of mingled traditions. Inscriptions in the Phoenician script mark Nora as one of the oldest places in the Western Mediterranean to bear written words. a striking contrast to Sardinia's oral culture. At Tharros, another settlement flourished on a peninsula with commanding views of sea routes. Solsis, further south, grew into a hub of commerce, linking Sardinia directly to the far reaches of Phoenician trade. Each site anchored foreign presence while drawing Nuragic communities into its orbit. The exchange was not one-sided. Nuragic crafts and metals flowed outward, carried in Phoenician ships to markets as far as Iberia and the Near East. Bronze figurines, Sardinian copper, and livestock became part of the wider economy once more. In return, Nuragic chiefs acquired exotic luxuries that enhanced their political standing. Imported pottery graced sanctuaries, glass beads adorned necklaces, and Phoenician styles began to mingle with local designs. The interaction enriched both sides, weaving Sardinia into the fabric of the Iron Age Mediterranean. Religion, too, felt the influence of contact. Phoenician deities arrived with their temples, standing beside the sacred wells of the Nuragic people. While the two traditions remained distinct, proximity created dialogue. Offerings of bronze figurines continued at Sardinian shrines, but new types of ornaments appeared, echoing Eastern fashions. Over time, some Nuragic communities may have joined Phoenicians in honoring foreign gods, while Phoenician settlers may have offered at Sardinian sanctuaries to maintain good relations. The mingling of sacred practices reflects the larger pattern of coexistence. Not all was harmony. Control of harbors and resources inevitably led to competition. Phoenician settlements clustered along coasts, while Nuragic power remained rooted in the interior. Chiefs who had once dominated coastal trade routes now found themselves negotiating with foreigners who built their own fortified quarters. Skirmishes are hinted at in burned layers and hurried fortifications near some sites. The balance between cooperation and rivalry remained delicate, shifting with each generation, depending on trade flows, alliances, and disputes. Despite tensions, the relationship endured for centuries. Archaeological evidence shows Nuragic pottery styles continuing alongside Phoenician imports, proof that local communities maintained their identity while absorbing foreign goods. The villages inland remained strong, their towers still occupied, even as coastal zones became more mixed. Rather than erasing Nuragic culture, Phoenician presence added a new dimension, creating hybrid spaces where two traditions lived side by side. The Phoenicians themselves were not a single empire, but a network of city-states, each with its own ambitions. Sidon, Tyre, and other Levantine ports sent settlers west, drawn by metals and fertile land. Sardinia became one of many nodes in their system, alongside sites in North Africa, Spain, and Sicily. For the Nuragic people, this meant that the new neighbors were diverse, sometimes friendly, sometimes domineering, but never monolithic. Relationships varied from harbor to harbor, reflecting local circumstances rather than centralized policy. Material culture from this era captures the vibrancy of exchange. Nuragic bronzes found their way into Phoenician contexts, while foreign ornaments turned up in Sardinian sanctuaries. Ship models continued to be offered in bronze, but now some included details inspired by Phoenician designs. Writing appeared on stone stelae, marking the presence of literacy, even if it remained foreign to most locals. Pottery fragments from distant lands show that Sardinia had rejoined the Mediterranean circuit, its goods and people once more entangled in the affairs of empires. Yet beneath this cooperation lay seeds of future conflict. As settlements like Nora and Tharros expanded, they took on characteristics of colonies rather than temporary posts. Phoenicians built their own temples, cemeteries, and defensive walls, signaling permanence. For Nuragic communities nearby, this shift must have been unsettling. Guests had become neighbors, and neighbors began to act like rulers. The balance between partnership and competition tilted gradually toward tension, a tension that would one day invite intervention from Carthage, the rising Phoenician power in the Western Mediterranean. For now, however, the story remained one of coexistence. Nuragic chiefs dined with Phoenician merchants, sanctuaries welcomed offerings from both traditions, and trade enriched communities that had survived the turbulence of the Bronze Age. Sardinia, once turned inward by crisis, was outward looking again, tied to a Mediterranean alive with commerce and migration. Its towers still stood, but beside them rose new buildings of foreign style, reminders that the island's identity was being reshaped by encounters with the wider world. The arrival of the Phoenicians marked the beginning of Sardinia's Iron Age connections. What began as trade and settlement would evolve into rivalry and conquest. The new neighbors, once welcomed for their goods and skills, would eventually become the masters of the coasts. And from that dominance, the next chapter of Sardinia's history would unfold, as Carthage rose to claim the island's shores and challenge the resilience of its ancient towers. The seas that once carried Phoenician merchants soon bore the sails of their heirs, Carthaginians from North Africa. Founded by settlers from Tyre, Carthage had grown from a coastal city into a power that commanded fleets and armies. By the 6th century before Christ, it turned its gaze westward, seeking control of trade routes and the islands that dotted the Mediterranean. Sardinia, with its harbours and resources, became an inevitable prize. Where Phoenician merchants had lived as neighbours, Carthaginian soldiers arrived as conquerors. The first campaigns struck at coastal settlements. Tharros, Nora, and Sulcis, already Phoenician in origin, became the footholds for expansion. Carthaginian troops fortified these towns, building new walls, temples, and harbours to secure their presence. From these strongholds, expeditions moved inland, clashing with Nuragic federations that had long dominated the valleys and hills. Skirmishes erupted around tower complexes, with Sardinian warriors defending stone walls against armies equipped with iron weapons and disciplined formations. The struggle was fierce, but the balance of power had shifted. Carthage commanded fleets, professional soldiers, and the resources of an empire. Resistance, however, was not easily crushed. Nuragic warriors fought with determination, relying on the strength of their towers and the rugged terrain of the interior. Raids and ambushes harried Carthaginian forces, making conquest a drawn-out process rather than a swift victory. Some tribes retreated into mountain regions, preserving their independence through isolation. Others negotiated, trading allegiance for survival, their chiefs rewarded with goods and positions within the new order. The story of Carthaginian conquest was not a single battle, but a mosaic of conflict, compromise, and endurance. Over time, Carthaginian control spread. Coastal zones became firmly Punic, with cities that reflected North African styles of architecture and religion. At Tharros, temples rose to gods like Baal-Hamon and Tanit, while necropolises filled with stone stelae carved in Punic script. Markets bustled with goods from Africa, Iberia, and beyond, tying Sardinia into a network that stretched across the western Mediterranean. The harbours, once visited by wandering traders, now served as stations of empire, guarded by soldiers and governed by officials sent from Carthage. Inland, Nuragic traditions persisted. Towers remained inhabited. Villages continued their cycles of herding and farming, and sanctuaries still hosted rituals. Archaeological evidence shows that giants' graves and sacred wells remained in use, with new offerings deposited even during Punic times. The rural population did not vanish under foreign rule, but adapted, maintaining identity while interacting with new neighbors. Carthaginian pottery and goods entered villages, yet the stone towers continued to dominate landscapes far from the coasts. The island became a patchwork, Punic cities on the shores, Nuragic strongholds in the interior. Cultural blending unfolded in daily life. Intermarriage linked Punic settlers with local families, creating communities where languages and traditions mingled. Farmers sold produce to Punic markets, while Sardinian warriors sometimes served as mercenaries in Carthaginian armies abroad. In sanctuaries, bronze figurines remained common, but alongside them appeared imported goods dedicated to foreign gods. The interaction was not equal, for Carthage held military supremacy, yet it was complex, creating a society that combined elements of both traditions. The persistence of Nuragic culture, alongside Punic dominance, demonstrates resilience. Even as Carthage imposed its authority, rural communities held onto their towers and rituals, ensuring continuity. Chiefs continued to wield influence within their valleys, though now often under the watchful eye of Punic governors. Rebellions flared periodically, evidence that subjugation never erased local pride. Carthaginian inscriptions mention campaigns against Sardinian tribes well into later centuries, showing that control was always contested. Economically, the island grew integrated into Carthaginian systems. Grain, livestock, and metals flowed from Sardinia to North Africa, supporting the needs of Carthage's growing population and military. In return, goods from across the empire arrived. Pottery, glass, tools, and luxuries that filtered into both cities and villages. Trade routes through Sardinia strengthened Carthage's naval dominance, allowing it to compete with rivals like Etruria and eventually Rome. Sardinia became both supplier and fortress, vital to Carthage's position in the Western Sea. Religious life reflected this integration. Punic gods stood beside Nuragic shrines, sometimes coexisting, sometimes competing. At Tharros, stelae inscribed with symbols of Tanit and Baal-Hamon testify to rituals of sacrifice and devotion brought from North Africa. Yet inland, sacred wells still received offerings of bronze ships and figurines. The coexistence reveals a dual identity, one Sardinia tied to Carthage, another rooted in its ancestral towers. People navigated between the two, adopting elements of Punic worship while maintaining old traditions in parallel. The architecture of Punic cities contrasted with the stone towers of Nuragic villages. Rectangular houses, paved streets, and planned layouts reflected North African and Levantine influence. In contrast, the circular huts and massive Nuraghi of the interior preserved older forms. To travel from coast to mountain was to cross between two worlds, urban colonies tied to Carthage and rural communities that carried forward Sardinia's deep-rooted past. The juxtaposition became a defining feature of the island's Iron Age. Despite integration, resistance endured. Mountain tribes in the central ranges remained especially defiant, striking at Punic forces when opportunities arose. These groups, later remembered as fierce opponents even of Rome, maintained independence longer than others. Their persistence ensured that Sardinia never became fully subdued, even under Carthaginian rule. Control of coasts and fertile plains was secure, but the rugged heart of the island remained a realm where Nuragic traditions endured with little interruption. By the 5th and 4th centuries before Christ, Sardinia was firmly part of the Carthaginian sphere. Its cities prospered as trading centers. Its fields supplied grain and livestock, and its harbours served fleets that challenged rivals across the Mediterranean. Yet beneath this prosperity lay tension. The Nuragic towers still dotted the land, silent reminders of an older identity. Rural communities preserved memories of independence, and rebellions smouldered whenever opportunity arose. Carthage could govern, but it could never entirely erase the people who had built the island's towers and sanctuaries. The Punic conquest thus reshaped Sardinia without extinguishing its character. The island became a crossroads where African, Levantine, and native traditions interwove. Carthaginian temples rose beside Nuragic sanctuaries. Punic merchants bargained with Sardinian herders, and hybrid communities carried both legacies. Yet the dominance of Carthage meant that Sardinia's fate was tied to the fortunes of its new rulers. When a greater power appeared on the horizon, Rome, the island would once again become a contested prize, its people caught between empires. When Carthage lost its hold on the western Mediterranean after the First Punic War, Sardinia became the next prize. In 238 BC, Rome annexed the island, adding it to its growing dominion. The change came not through conquest of towers, but through diplomacy and pressure. Carthage, weakened and distracted, surrendered Sardinia and Corsica to avoid further conflict. For the Nuragic people, this shift meant yet another set of foreign rulers, this time a power that would not retreat. Roman soldiers arrived to secure key towns and harbours. Coastal cities that had once flown Phoenician banners now accepted Roman governors and garrisons. Latin voices echoed in markets where Punic had been spoken, and Roman coinage began to circulate. Yet inland, in the rugged mountains of central Sardinia, independence still thrived. Tribes such as the Illienses and Bellari refused to acknowledge Roman authority. Their towers and hilltop villages remained bastions of resistance, as they had under Carthage before. The resistance was not symbolic. Roman historians record multiple uprisings, each demanding military campaigns to suppress. In 215 BC, during the Second Punic War, Sardinian tribes rebelled in alliance with Carthaginian sympathizers. Roman forces crushed the revolt, executing leaders and deporting captives. 6 decades later, in 177 BC, another great uprising flared, forcing Rome to send tens of thousands of soldiers. The fighting was brutal, and although Rome emerged victorious, the persistence of rebellion demonstrated how deeply the Nuragic identity endured. The mountains sheltered a spirit of defiance that even imperial armies struggled to break. Over time, however, the balance shifted. Roman colonists settled along fertile plains, founding farms and villas that altered the landscape. Roads cut across the island, linking coastal towns to inland markets. Roman law, language, and religion seeped gradually into daily life, carried by administrators, soldiers, and merchants. The Nuragic towers, once centers of power, fell into disuse or became incorporated into rural estates. Some served as barns, watchtowers, or foundations for new buildings. Others crumbled quietly, their stones reused in walls and houses. Yet the Nuragic people did not disappear overnight. In villages, old customs persisted. Round huts remained in use. Weaving and herding followed ancestral rhythms, and sacred wells continued to receive offerings well into Roman times. Cultural assimilation was uneven, moving faster in coastal towns than in the isolated mountains. For generations, Sardinia remained a land of dual identity, Roman in its cities, Nuragic in its countryside. Only gradually did the Roman order prevail, blending with what remained of local traditions. By the 1st century BC, Sardinia was firmly a Roman province, valued for its grain, livestock, and strategic harbors. Roman poets and generals mentioned the island, often describing its rugged mountains and stubborn inhabitants. The Illienses and Bellari, though weakened, lingered in memory as symbols of resistance. To Roman eyes, Sardinia was both useful and troublesome, a place that could supply resources but never quite lose its independence of spirit. Centuries later, long after the last Nuragic chiefs had vanished, the towers still dotted the landscape. Farmers ploughed fields beneath their shadows, shepherds grazed flocks near their walls, and travellers used them as landmarks. Though their original meaning was forgotten, their presence ensured that the memory of Sardinia's ancient builders endured. The stones themselves became guardians of history, silent but immovable. In modern times, these ruins regained their voice. Archaeologists uncovered their secrets, none more influential than Giovanni Liliu, who in the 1950s excavated Nuragic at Barumini. His work revealed the scale and sophistication of the Nuragic world, bringing its story to global attention. What had once been silent ruins became symbols of Sardinian identity, reminders that long before Rome, a unique civilization had flourished on the island. Today, Nuragic stands as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, visited by thousands who walk its corridors and climb its towers. The end of the Nuragic world, under Rome, was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual fading. Resistance gave way to accommodation, traditions blended with new influences, and towers slipped from power into memory. Yet the legacy endures in the stones that still rise across Sardinia. They tell of communities that built with vision, that honored their dead in giants' graves, that gathered at sacred wells, and that defended their land with bronze and courage. Rome absorbed Sardinia, but it never erased its past. The Nuragic civilization may have lost its independence, but it left behind one of the most striking landscapes of prehistoric Europe. Even today, the towers stand, weathered, silent, enduring. Reminders that long before legions marched, Sardinia was a land of builders, sailors, warriors, and dreamers whose legacy survives in stone.